Okay, so our group covered the Gonzales versus Raich Supreme Court case. My name is Mahir, and we also have 4 other members, Charlie, Neil, Andy, and Alex. Okay, so the case background. So in 1996, California passed Prop 215, which essentially legalized medical marijuana in the state. However, this prop directly conflicted with the Controlled Substances Act, which completely outlawed the use of marijuana in the US. So in 2002, Angel Raich, a resident of Oakland, California, I believe, was growing medical marijuana, or just marijuana, for medical purposes in her house. And then the sheriff's department, or officers from the sheriff's department, along with the DEA, came into her house and destroyed 6 of her plants because they violated the Controlled Substances Act. So, of course, Raich sued because she believed that it was unconstitutional that these people could destroy her plants. And this case really brought up the idea of state versus federal power. And if state laws directly conflict with federal laws, how do you go about solving these conflicts?
Gonzales v. Raich debates the question, does the Controlled Substances Act exceed Congress's power under the Commerce Clause as applied to interstate cultivation and possession of medical marijuana? Essentially, this question asks if growing medical marijuana has enough impact to require Congress to regulate. The case received votes 6-3 saying no, that it is entirely under Congress's power to regulate the distribution of medical marijuana. However, this question more closely debated whether the growing of medical marijuana locally has any impact on the national marijuana market, to which they ruled that it does. Your dinky little medical marijuana growing is a threat to the national market of marijuana, and thus needs to be obliterated by government officials.
Now, it's perfectly understandable if none of this made any sense. So here is a relatively similar analogy. Let's say that SRVUSD's school board wanted every student to have an equal opportunity to succeed, which is perfectly reasonable. In this fictional case, there's a teacher at DVHS, Mrs. S, who wanted to give out extra credit to her AP government students that were teetering on the edge of failing. Well, the school admin notices and feels that it is unfair, so he straight up enters the classroom, accesses the gradebook, and removes every extra credit assignment, essentially failing the struggling students. No way was Mrs. S going to let this off the hook, so she took this case up to the school board. Does the school board think that extra credit falls into the category of giving students an opportunity and advantage? Well, in the context of Gonzales v. Raich case, the school board would be the Supreme Court. Extra credit would be the equivalent to medical marijuana. Mrs. S's AP government class would be like California, and the struggling students would be those needing the medical marijuana. In our analogy, the school board deemed that Mrs. S giving out the extra credit would inflate the GPA of students in the school, thus creating an environment that isn't giving equal opportunity to all. In Gonzales versus Raich, Congress believed that the growing of medical marijuana on the local level is impacting the national marijuana market as a whole, which is something they have a responsibility to manage. Extra credit is like medical marijuana, so kids stay in school, don't do drugs.
This issue is related to the federalism because for the federal government, they passed the Controlled Substances Act, which is also known as CSA, that bans the usage of any kind of marijuana. However, some states make laws that allowing the usage of medical marijuana, which is against the federal law. Therefore, the case becomes a debate of federalism. There should be the government have more power, or should the states have more power? Even though the cases end up with a 6-3 voting favors the federal law, it leaves more questions. A Supreme Court judge said the CSA regulates economic activities, the production, distribution, and consumption of commodities of which there is an established interstate market. If marijuana planted for private use can be considered as national goods, and how to draw the boundary between state and nation goods. The debate continues even today. And how the case impact today? Honestly, there's barely any impact that we have today. As we can see in this map, there are 15 states that ignore the CSA and legalize the marijuana, and most of the states allowed some extent of usage of marijuana. Even though the government is trying to enforce the CSA, there's many barriers that stop them from doing it. The first problem is a population. In America, there's more than 1 million people is using marijuana right now, and it is impossible for the federal government to put all those people into jail. And the second reason is because the marijuana is pretty useful in the medical area. It is cheap, and it's a replaceable thing for another expensive medicines.
So we can back up a little bit here and see why there's been a little bit of a small impact, but also there's been a ton of problems and of course solutions regarding this conflict between state and federal power. The Obama administration was aware of how difficult it was to manage these two powers, especially regarding marijuana. And so Obama's Solicitor General told the Supreme Court they didn't want to hear one of these cases. One case in particular was about Colorado's neighboring states complaining about the legalization of recreational marijuana in Colorado. And that was pretty rare at the time. Only 4 states went beyond the legalization of just medical marijuana. And people read into the Obama administration's decision thinking it meant that the administration wanted federal power to be used to legalize marijuana. Obama would show that their decision, because Obama would direct the Justice Department to make stopping drug trafficking a priority. One of the priorities was not about people who are simply following their state laws regarding drugs. There were even more problems too, because with each year it got more and more difficult to enforce the Controlled Substances Act. This is because realistically, when you want to enforce laws, you have to be really strict about it. And in this case, millions of people who followed state laws, they would end up going to prison if the law was enforced. So in 2013, you got a very honest response from the Department of Justice saying the Controlled Substances Act is important, yes, but it's practically impossible to enforce it, and it's necessary to respond to only the biggest threats. The Justice Department pointed out that what is realistic is to avoid spreading marijuana to youth and to everyone in the states where it is illegal. So that ended up becoming their solution. And now we move into the Trump administration. At the start of the Trump administration, people wondered about new changes. Would marijuana be taken off the list of substances the federal government would control? Would more states get to decide if marijuana should be legalized, and for what medical reasons or for recreation? Jeff Sessions, when he was confirmed as Attorney General, said no. He believes that, or he says that he believes that marijuana is just as dangerous as other drugs like heroin. There are still many problems with federal laws versus state laws because marijuana can be illegally distributed beyond state borders, like with Washington State, for example, when they legalized marijuana for recreation. Jeff Sessions said he would let each US attorney decide for themselves if they should prosecute or not, so that ended up becoming their solution. Okay, all right. We hope you all learned a lot about Gonzales versus Raich and its effects on today. Thank you for listening.